Any other questions?
I wonder about your argument about the relationship between children and their parents and children in peer groups, and whether you think that children's accents are shaped by peer groups universally, or whether that's a culturally specific phenomenon. And then also, even if children's accents are shaped by their peer groups, is that not in some ways a response to how they've understood the ways in which their parents' accents or language use might be received? I mean, so I just wonder whether you're saying that, in fact, that parents, the modes of socialization that are taking place in the home aren't still in play in some sense, even if just in response to them.
I think that, I can't say universal, but every study that I've seen certainly supports that certainly the peer group is crucial. And in fact, if a kid goes from one peer group to another peer group in another town, another city, I'd be interested in, Jenny, that you went to Austria, right? And I would have been very interested to see what happened to your language patterns as you move from one peer group to another. So the point is, at what point does the peer group cease to be that influential? And they look at the critical age hypothesis, right? So that that becomes an issue when kids turn 13, 14, and so forth. And so I would think probably pretty universal. And of course, even in England, of course, you go to private schools, you're probably all living in the same community. The thing that strikes me about the UK is that you just go from one village to another. You think you're in a different country. Or there's two schools side by side and they speak very differently, right? So I do think that this is pretty universal. And in terms of parents, yeah, I don't, it's the same answer to the same question. I don't think parents, when children are young, of course, before they head to school, of course, then they're going to be different patterns. But I think once kids hit daycare or the school, that's where you're going to start seeing those changes.
Do you have any studies, or does anyone here know of anybody who has looked at the identity accent shift among adults? I'm referring to people who marry somebody who has a different accent. Somehow they end up adopting that accent, and then the other spouse shifts to the accent of the other spouse. So both end up, as adults. This phenomenon I've seen, and I've just wondered if anybody else here has observed that.
I do it myself. No, I was just going to say I spend a lot of time talking to European native speakers of languages which in the present tense use the simple present rather than the progressive to describe an ongoing action. Like instead of saying, what are you doing? What do you do? Or something like that. And in speaking to these people, I find myself doing exactly. I've had other native speakers of English catch me out doing this and challenging me on it. So I think it's inevitable that this kind of thing happens.
It's an interesting question. I can certainly see vocabulary shift. When people have to talk, instead of talking about trunk or, the boot or the trunk, people have to change. I know myself, I've had to change vocabulary as I've in North America. But the accent is another whole question. I'd be very interested. Is there any comment on that? Or is this a different comment?
I have an interesting example. When my daughter, I'm a native speaker of Hungarian. My daughter, who's sitting next to me, when she was born here, when she was about 5 or 6, she spent a lot of time with my mother, who speaks with a very thick Hungarian accent. And she spent 4 or 5 hours with her every day. And for a while, and I could kick myself for not recording this because she stopped doing this, but my daughter would speak English to me and my husband, who was American, fluently without an accent. But she would speak to my mother, turn to my mother, and approach her and speak to her with a thick Hungarian accent. And she would turn back to us without an accent, switch back to grandma with a Hungarian accent, sort of shifting identities.
That's astonishing.
Because she never really spoke, Andrea never learned Hungarian fluently. She spoke it okay, but she felt, I thought, that Grandma would understand her better if she spoke to her with a Hungarian accent. And I think the more she started spending time with her peer group, daycare and school, the more she lost that.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, it was. I wish I had
Yes,
preserved that.
Bidialectal. I think there was, I don't know if we're running out of time, but there was a question at the back there.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I felt a lot of agency in the way that you spoke about children, and I think that's very powerful. Anecdotally, my family's from Central America, and I remember growing up in downtown LA with a lot of Mexican youth, and I switched my intonation and my accent to fit into the Mexican language. So I think that we do that, a sensibility to fit in and to, I guess, negotiate those identities and to be part of something.
Exactly. I think, well, it's great that you can actually remember that. I hope you're writing your PhD on that. There's a study there. But I think it would be very interesting, of course, when these things happen. Children are, I think it's done in a very subtle kinds of ways. I don't know that children are even that aware of how they're adapting. But I think there's some very interesting studies that can be done on precisely that shift as kids enter into the peer networks and the changes that take place.
I see it in my children now.
There you go. Well, thank you very much, everybody.